وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا ولإخواننا الذين سبقونا بالإيمان ولا تجعل في قلوبنا غلا للذين آمنوا ربنا إنك رؤوف رحيم. اللهم أنت العزيز الجليل. Sesungguhnya kami pada pagi ini ingin merafak kesyukuran dan pujian terhadap-Mu atas kurniaan nikmat-Mu yang tidak ternilai. Ya Allah, Ya Fatah, Ya Alim. Kami bersyukur kerana dengan taufik hidayah-Mu serta keizinan-Mu, maka kami pada pagi ini dapat bersama berada dalam Majlis Perasmian, First Online International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022, IPG Campus Tengku Ampuan Afzan. Ya Allah, we gather here today to express our gratitude and appreciation upon your greatest gift to us. Therefore, Ya Allah, in conjunction to this event, we would like to seek for your help and guidance. May Allah ease and bless us all our efforts to ensure this event will be successful. Allahumma ya Hakim ya Azim. Sesungguhnya kami berhimpun di sini bagi menyatakan kesungguhan, komitmen dan itizam kami dengan roh dan semangat untuk membangun, membina serta mendidik dan memertabatkan anak bangsa supaya berbudi dan berjasa kepada agama, bangsa dan negara. Justru itu, berkatilah petuan kami ini, berkatilah jua usaha-usaha kami, ilhamkanlah dalam fikiran dan minda kami idea-idea yang bernas, pandangan-pandangan yang jelas dan keputusan-keputusan yang waras. Gunakanlah kepada kami limpahan ilmu yang berguna dan kefahaman yang benar. Satukanlah hati-hati kami, eratkanlah silaturahim di antara kami, padukanlah tenaga dan usaha kami untuk memartabatkan pendidikan negara secara bersama demi mencapai kecemerlangan dan kegemilangan. Allahumma ya alim ya khabir. Jadikanlah kami ya Allah dalam kalangan hamba-hamba-Mu yang taat dan bersyukur. Jauhkanlah kami ya Allah dari melanggari perintah-Mu. Kurniakanlah kepada kami kesihatan yang berpanjangan, kesejahteraan yang sempurna, fikiran yang waras, minda yang cergas, rezeki yang halal, zuriat dan generasi yang beriman, serta segala kebaikan di dunia dan di akhirat. Allahumma ja'al jam'ana hadha jam'an marhuma wa tafarruqana min ba'dihi tafarruqan ma'suma wa la taj'al Allahumma fina wa la ma'na wa la man yatba'una shaqiyyan wa la matrudan wa la mahruma. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanatan wa qina adzaban nar. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Amin amin ya rabbal alamin. Terima kasih diucapkan kepada Dr. Wan Azlan bin Wan Adnan alias Wan Refol atas bacaan doa itu tadi. Hadirin sekalian, InCIST 2022 merupakan persidangan bertaraf antarabangsa yang julung kalinya dianjurkan oleh IPG Campus Tengku Ampuan Afzan. Persidangan ini dapat mengembangkan ilmu melalui perkongsian kepakaran penyelidik tempatan dan antarabangsa. Selain itu juga, persidangan ini dapat membangunkan minda kelas pertama dalam kalangan pendidik melalui jalinan kerjasama dan perkongsian ilmu serta kepakaran dalam rakan sinergi persidangan. Oleh itu, persidangan ini dapat mengembangkan daya saing dalam kalangan pendidik untuk menghasilkan penyelidikan dan inovasi yang berimpak tinggi. Hadirin sekalian, emas tempawan buatmu puteri, busana indah buat rupawan, sudilah tuan tampilkan diri bersama madah kata aluan. Dengan ini, dipersilakan Tuan Haji Abdullah bin Muhammad Yusof, pengarah IPG Campus Tengku Ampuan Afzan untuk menyampaikan ucapan. Dipersilakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera dan salam keluarga Malaysia. Saya mulakan ucapan ini dengan serangkap pantun. Mencari timba si anak dara di bawah sarang burung tempua. Salam sembah pembuka bicara. Selamat datang untuk semua. Yang Berusaha Dr. Hajjah Rosmini binti Ku Ahmad, Rektor Institut Pendidikan Guru Malaysia. Yang berbahagia Profesor Emeritus Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak, Rektor Universiti Islam Antarabangsa. Yang hormat Datuk Mahmud Muhammad Nawi, Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Yayasan Pahang. Yang Berusaha Tuan Muhammad Rosli Abdul Rahman, Pengarah Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang. Yang berbahagia Profesor Madya Dr. Zainal Abidin Sanusi, Pengarah Pusat Sejahtera Universiti Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia. Yang Berusaha Timbalan Rektor Kanan, Timbalan-timbalan Rektor, Pegawai-pegawai kanan di IPJM, Pengarah-pengarah IPG Kampus, Timbalan-timbalan pengarah IPG Kampus, Pegawai-pegawai Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang dan Yayasan Pahang, Pesyarah-pesyarah, hadirin, hadirat yang dihormati serta pelajar-pelajar yang saya kasihi. Saya dengan penuh kesyukuran mengalu-alukan kehadiran semua tetamu yang berada dalam talian bagi memeriahkan acara peresmian pembukaan International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022, InCIST 2022. Yang Berusaha Dr. Tan Sri Dato', Yang Berusaha Dr. Hadirin yang dihormati, Keputusan idea bagi melaksanakan InCIST 2022 mempunyai sejarah yang amat agak panjang di peringkat IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan. Alhamdulillah, akhirnya dapat direalisasikan pada hari ini 1 November 2022 hingga 3 November 2022. Pihak IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan pada peringkat awalnya menyingkap tabir Pelan Pembangunan Pendidikan Malaysia PPPM dan Pelan Strategik Transformasi Institut Pendidikan Guru dalam merungkai intipati hasrat KPM dan IPJM bagi penyelidikan dan inovasi sehingga ke peringkat antarabangsa apabila memasuki fasa gelombang ketiga 2021-2025. Rentetan itu, IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan perlu melangkah seiring dan sejalan, berlari, mengejar dan menjulang visi misi IPJM sebagai peneraju kecemerlangan pendidikan guru bertaraf dunia secara realistik. Maka dengan itu, perbincangan dan pemuafakatan berjaya dimeterai antara IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan dengan rakan-rakan sinergi di peringkat awal secara dalam talian dan seterusnya melalui perundingan meja bulat secara bersemuka dapat juga diadakan di IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan, di Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang, Yayasan Pahang dan juga UIAM bagi memutuskan beberapa perkara yang penting demi kejayaan InCIST 2022 ini. Saya merasa kagum dengan kekentalan, semangat juang tanpa erti jemu dan berputus asa dalam kalangan semua pihak yang terlibat memastikan InCIST 2022 ini berjaya dilaksanakan. Penakik pisau seraut, ambil galah batang lintabung, seludang jadikan nyiru, setitik jadikan laut, sekepal jadikan gunung, alam terbentang jadikan guru. Oleh itu, saya dengan penuh tulus ikhlas ingin merakamkan ucapan terima kasih yang tidak terhingga kepada Yayasan Pahang, Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang dan Pusat Sejahtera UIAM yang sudi berkolaboratif dengan IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan menyumbang dana kewangan, tenaga, kepakaran, kemahiran serta buah fikiran bagi menjayakan InCIST 2022. Saya juga ingin menzahirkan ucapan penghargaan kepada Yang Berusaha Dr. Rektor IPJM yang berbesar hati meresmikan pembukaan InCIST 2022 pada hari ini. Sesungguhnya segala bantuan, sokongan dan curahan bakti yang diberikan oleh semua pihak dalam menjayakan InCIST 2022 ini amat besar dan penting bagi kami pihak APG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan sebagai penganjur. APG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan yang masih sentiasa berusaha mengupayakan penganjuran bertaraf program pengantarbangsaan, kami amat bersyukur kerana dapat berganding bahu bersama-sama rakan sinergi bagi mengukir sejarah dalam penganjuran kolokium pendidikan dan inovasi kali ini. Pada kesempatan ini, saya ingin mengucapkan syabas dan tahniah kepada semua ahli tangkuasa kerja InCIST 2022 termasuk panel penilai, penyelidikan dan inovasi yang dilantik dalam kalangan pensyarah IPGK dan IPT. Terima kasih juga kepada semua peserta dan pembentang kajian penyelidikan dan inovasi yang berjaya menyertai InCIST 2022. Pastinya cabaran meladani komitmen tugas, masa dan suasana tidak menjadi halangan untuk kita sama-sama meraihkan InCIST 2022. Hadirin yang saya muliakan, InCIST 2022 yang dianjurkan oleh APG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Abzan dengan kerjasama Yayasan Pahang, Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang dan Pusat Sejahtera UIAM merupakan satu keunikan dalam menonjolkan kepentingan pendidikan orang asli Malaysia ke peringkat dunia. Kepentingan pendidikan orang asli menjadi agenda utama negara bagi mengangkat martabat masyarakat orang asli. Justru itu, IPJM mengurat langkah proaktif mengangkat pendidikan orang asli melalui guru-guru dalam kalangan orang asli sendiri untuk mengangkat tahap pendidikan pribumi ke tahap yang tertinggi. Kita berpegang kepada kata-kata maju mundurnya sesuatu bangsa itu dapat diubah oleh tangan bangsa itu sendiri. Maju bangsa, majulah negara. Hadirin yang saya raikan, sesungguhnya penyertaan InCIST 2022 mendapat sambutan yang menggalakkan dalam kalangan pensyarah IPGK dan IPT, guru-guru dan pelajar-pelajar IPGK dan IPT. Sekali lagi, saya merakamkan penghargaan dan selamat membentang dapatan penyelidikan dan inovasi dalam 3 hari InCIST 2022 ini berlangsung. Saya pasti insya-Allah InCIST 2022 menjadi platform yang baik kepada semua pihak untuk berkongsi ilmu penyelidikan dan inovasi serta menambah pengetahuan dalam memantapkan kecemerlangan pendidikan negara. Akhir kata, saya juga ingin melahirkan penghargaan kepada semua pihak yang terlibat sama ada secara langsung dan secara tidak langsung dalam InCIST 2022. Saya sudahi ucapan alu-aluan ini dengan serakat pantun pergi berhuma ke Tanjung Rokan sebelum pulang mengail ikan. Kehadiran tuan-puan kami alu-alukan, kecil tapak tangan nyiru kami tadahkan. Sekian, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Majlis merakamkan ucapan terima kasih kepada Tuan Haji Abdullah bin Muhammad Yusof atas ucapan yang disampaikan sebentar tadi. Hadirin sekalian, daun semulur di Pekansari, batang jerami rebah ke bumi, madah dihulur sembah diberi, kata perasmi hajatnya kami. Tanpa melengahkan masa, marilah kita sama-sama mendengar ucapan perasmian oleh Dr. Hajah Rusmini binti Ku Ahmad, Rektor Institut Pendidikan Guru Malaysia. Dengan ini, majlis mempersilakan Dr. Hajah Rusmini binti Ku Ahmad untuk menyampaikan ucapan dan seterusnya merasmikan majlis perasmian pembukaan InCIST 2022. Dengan segala hormatnya, dipersilakan.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang berbahagia Profesor Emeritus Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak, Rektor Universiti Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia. Yang berbahagia Datuk Mahmud Muhammad Nawawi, Ketua Pegawai Eksekutif Yayasan Pahang. Yang berusaha Tuan Muhammad Rosli Abdul Rahman, Pengarah Jabatan Pendidikan Negeri Pahang. Yang berusaha Tuan Haji Abdullah Muhammad Yusof, Pengarah IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Afzan. Yang berbahagia Profesor Madya Dr. Zainal Abidin Sanusi, Pengarah Sejahtera Center for Sustainability and Humanity, Universiti Islam Antarabangsa Malaysia, pensyarah-pensyarah dan hadirin yang dihormati. Saya ingin mulakan dengan mengucapkan tahniah kepada IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Afzan atas penganjuran International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022. Tema tahun ini, Sustaining Research and Innovation for Future Education, merupakan aspek penting yang perlu diterokai oleh guru dan pendidik dalam era pasca pandemik ini. Hadirin yang dihormati sekalian, pendidikan merupakan satu proses sistematik untuk mencari dan mendapatkan ilmu terhadap perkara yang dikaji, manakala inovasi bermaksud pembaharuan atau modifikasi bagi tujuan memenuhi fungsi atau tuntutan pasaran tertentu. Menurut E.M. Rogers pula, teori difusi inovasi yang dibawa oleh beliau menjelaskan bahawa inovasi yang berjaya memerlukan difusi dan adopsi oleh komuniti terhadap suatu inovasi yang diperkenalkan. Beliau menjelaskan bahawa proses adopsi akan berlaku secara berperingkat dan berbeza berdasarkan tahap penerimaan perubahan individu-individu dalam komuniti. Setengah kumpulan individu mampu menerima perubahan secara lebih laju, manakala akan ada kumpulan kecil yang tidak akan terima perubahan. Berdasarkan teori ini juga, tahap penerimaan masyarakat terhadap satu inovasi atau perubahan adalah bergantung kepada 5 aspek, iaitu tahap bagaimana inovasi baharu dilihat sebagai lebih baik daripada inovasi yang digantikannya. Yang kedua, tahap keserasian inovasi dengan sasaran penggunanya. Ketiga, tahap kompleksiti inovasi untuk difahami atau digunakan oleh sasaran penggunanya. Keempat, tahap fleksibiliti inovasi untuk dirintis, diuji dan dikaji sebelum dilancarkan sepenuhnya. Dan tahap keupayaan inovasi untuk menunjukkan keberhasilan yang boleh diukur. Perkara ini juga selari dengan pendekatan design thinking. Mereka yang menggunakan pendekatan design thinking untuk menghasilkan produk akan mengulang proses reka bentuk produk secara berterusan berdasarkan maklum balas pengguna sasar sehingga mencapai 100% kepuasan oleh pengguna. Pendekatan ini sekaligus dapat menghasilkan produk atau inovasi yang lebih kompetitif dan relevan dalam pasaran. Dalam konteks ini, kita boleh olah bahawa dalam penyelidikan dan inovasi berkualiti, ianya haruslah relevan serta memberi nilai kepada masyarakat sasaran. Maka penyelidikan dan inovasi dalam pendidikan seharusnya membantu para guru dan pendidik dalam meningkatkan keberkesanan PDP dan pencapaian sistem pendidikan negara. Tuan-tuan dan puan-puan sekalian, izinkan saya berkongsi juga kisah seorang pakar bidang pemasaran dan pembangunan software Amerika Syarikat, Guy Kawasaki, yang pernah menyentuh berkaitan the art of innovation. Menurut beliau, salah satu perspektif yang penting dalam penghasilan inovasi adalah perspektif jump to the next curve atau melompat ke satu aras yang lebih tinggi. Ini bermaksud inovasi tidak berlaku sekiranya kita hanya duduk di takut lama ataupun sekadar memberikan komitmen untuk melaksanakan suatu perkara 10% lebih baik dari dulu. Beliau maksudkan bahawa inovasi yang hebat hanya berlaku sekiranya kita berani dan berjaya membuat lompatan yang boleh memecahkan rekod lama dan mencipta sejarah baru. Inilah lompatan yang mampu mengubah evolusi telefon ke internet kini, ataupun revolusi printer hitam putih ke printer 3D yang kita lihat sekarang. Semasa Guy Kawasaki bekerja di syarikat Apple juga, beliau menyatakan bahawa kejayaan inovasi Macintosh bukan hanya kerana mereka inginkan sekadar Apple versi 2.0, tetapi mereka dahagakan perubahan dalam teknologi komputer peribadi atau PC. Kesannya, tim mereka telah menghasilkan legasi komputer dan laptop Mac yang kita kenali sekarang. Sidang hadirin yang saya hormati sekalian, sesebuah institusi pengajian tinggi sememangnya memainkan peranan yang penting dalam membudayakan penyelidikan dan inovasi dalam kalangan warganya, serta menyumbang kepada pembangunan nilai dan budaya kepada komuniti setempat. Maka penganjuran persidangan seperti International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022 ini merupakan satu mekanisme yang dapat menggiatkan lagi penyelidikan dan inovasi dalam kalangan warga pendidik setempat. Persidangan ini juga membuka ruang seluas-luasnya kepada para pengamal penyelidikan dan inovasi untuk membentang, membincang, membahas serta bertukar pendapat dalam bidang masing-masing. Pada tahun ini sebanyak 14 subtema yang telah disenaraikan, iaitu inovasi pengajaran dan pembelajaran, kajian orang asli, sosioekonomi dalam pendidikan, kurikulum dan pedagogi, teknologi pendidikan, pendidikan STEM, pendidikan bahasa, bimbingan dan kaunseling, pendidikan awal kanak-kanak, pendidikan pintar cerdas, kajian sains sosial, pengukuran dan penilaian dalam pendidikan, kepimpinan dan pengurusan pendidikan serta isu dan cabaran pendidikan. Subtema-subtema inilah secara keseluruhannya menggambarkan kata-kata kunci pendidikan masa depan selaras dengan tema utama persidangan ini. Yang bahagia Profesor, Datuk-Datuk, Tuan-Tuan dan Puan-Puan, besarlah harapan saya bagi pihak Institut Pendidikan Guru Malaysia agar persidangan ini mampu memberikan ruang dan peluang kepada pendidik dari dalam dan luar negara untuk membentang serta berkongsi dapatan penyelidikan dan inovasi dalam melestarikan pendidikan masa depan. Selain itu, persidangan ini juga dapat diharapkan akan memperkukuhkan lagi jaringan kolaboratif secara global dalam memacu matlamat untuk IPG, matlamat utama IPG untuk Go Global selaras dengan fasa ketiga program transformasi IPG 2016-2025 di bawah Plan Pembangunan Pendidikan Malaysia 2013-2025. Di samping itu, warga pendidik juga yang hadir akan dapat mantapkan ilmu dan merealisasikan aspirasi pembelajaran sepanjang hayat selaras dengan keperluan IR 4.0 serta memartabatkan pendidikan orang asli di Malaysia. Sesungguhnya bagi pihak Institut Pendidikan Guru Malaysia, sejuta penghargaan saya kalungkan kepada rakan-rakan sinergi yang bersama-sama IPG Kampus Tengku Ampuan Afzan dalam persidangan ini. Selain itu, tidak dilupakan juga kepada para tetamu undangan, para pembentang, peserta dan AJK persidangan. Setinggi-tinggi penghargaan dan terima kasih yang tidak terhingga atas komitmen dan kerjasama yang diberikan. Maka dengan lafaz yang mulia Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, saya merasmikan International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022. Sekian, wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Majlis merakamkan ucapan jutaan terima kasih kepada Dr. Hajar Rusmini binti Ko Ahmad atas ucapan dan perasmian yang disampaikan tadi. Bunga dedap di atas para anak dusun pasang pelita, kalau tersilap tutup bicara, jemari disusun, maaf dipinta. Pohon berangan tempat bertemu, girangnya rasa si anak dara, baliklah tuan membawa ilmu, binalah bangsa, bangunkan negara. Di atas dahan burung tempua, melihat rusa tepi perigi, salam perpisahan untuk semua, di lain masa bersua lagi. Akhir sekali, saya mewakili ahli jawatan fasa pelaksana memohon maaf sekiranya sepanjang majlis dijalankan terdapat kesulitan sama ada yang disengajakan ataupun tidak. Sesungguhnya yang baik itu datang daripada Allah Subhanahu Wa Taala dan yang tidak baik itu datang daripada diri saya sendiri. Saya sudahi majlis dengan wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh dan salam sejahtera. Baiklah semua, dengan berakhirnya majlis perasmian tadi, untuk makluman, persidangan kita akan ditangguhkan sementara untuk berhenti rehat dan akan bersambung semula pada jam 11 pagi. Terima kasih.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Ladies and gentlemen, the first keynote speech is going to start in 5 minutes. Please be prepared. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi israh li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Honorable Speaker, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you. Good morning, and first of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Khairunisa binti Haji Ahmad, and I will be the MC today. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend my warm welcome to all the guests to the first keynote speech of the International Conference on Indigenous Studies and Teaching 2022, or INCIST 2022, with the theme Sustaining Research and Innovation for Future Education, being hosted live for the first time in the Institute of Teacher Education, Tengku Ampuan Afzan Campus, Kuala Lipis, Pahang, Malaysia. It is a relevant platform to strengthen the global collaborative network in research, innovation, and development of teacher education, as well as providing a great opportunity for participants to share their recent theoretical knowledge, research findings, and experiences in dealing with sustainable future education, specifically for Indigenous students. Honorable Speaker, distinguished guests, participants, ladies and gentlemen. We are now continuing our meeting to the next agenda, that is to hear the first keynote speech, which will be delivered by Rector of International Islamic University Malaysia, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato' Zulkifli Abdul Razak. Before we proceed, let me share some astounding facts on our honorable keynote speaker. Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato' Zulkifli Abdul Razak is currently Director of the International Islamic University Malaysia. Tan Sri Dato' was the Vice Chancellor of University Science Malaysia from 2000 to 2011. He is the immediate past President of International Association of Universities, UNESCO affiliated organization based in Paris. Tan Sri Dato' was the convener of the Regional Center for Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development based in USM beginning 2005. Tan Sri Dato' was awarded the prestigious 2017 Gilbert Medal by Universitas 21 in recognition of his long-term commitment to a sustainable approach to international higher education. Tan Sri Dato' is a fellow of the Academy of Science Malaysia, the World Academy of Art and Science, and the World Academy of Islamic Management. Tan Sri Dato' was an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham from 2014 until August 2020, and more recently appointed senior advisor at Asia Europe Institute, UM. In February 2021, he was invited to serve as an expert for the Future of Higher Education project at UNESCO's Institute for Higher Education. Apart from that, Tan Sri Dato' was awarded the 2017 Tokoh Akademik Negara, National Academic Laureate, and recipient of number of honorary doctorate from various international universities. Locally, in October 2018, Tan Sri Dato' was conferred Professor Emeritus by USM Wilkes in November 2019. University Science Malaysia conferred him an honorary doctorate of Dakwah and Islamic Management in recognition of his efforts in widening the dimension of Dakwah through various research and leadership while serving at university. In addition, the government of Japan, in recognition of his contribution to the academic collaboration and exchanges between the two nations, has conferred him the Order of Rising Sun, gold raised with neck ribbon in September 2019. With that outstanding introduction, please welcome Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato' Zulkifli Abdul Razak.
I've sent in a video. I hope you can play that video. Huh? Malaysia especially. Now, I'm given this topic. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum. Greeting of peace and a very good morning to everyone. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this very exciting lecture, something that I loved and something that is very passionate to me when we talk about the future of education, particularly in the context of the indigenous population. Yeah. So let me begin by thanking you and also hoping that this will build a bridge between my university, the International Islamic University, and your IPGM, so that we can continue to develop the education for the indigenous people in particular, and also for Malaysia especially. Now, I'm given this topic, Future Trends in Educational Research and Innovation, and I've added a sub-theme called Embracing Sustainability, and RRI, which stands for Responsible Research and Innovation. These are the two elements that I thought would be new as we move into the future as far as education, teaching, and learning is concerned. Right? So I would want to start off by recognizing, I think there is something that we know, but we have not done enough about it. There is not one way of teaching or conveying knowledge to other people. Very different way of delivering, especially in the context of the indigenous population, because their situation, their living styles are all different from us, and therefore we are not obliged to sort of put them into a kind of a stereotype way of doing education the way we have done it in our school. To some of them, this is not the way education is given to them in their own context, and therefore we need to modify that. To modify this is to recognize that there are different ways of delivering information, knowledge, and also wisdom to a certain extent. Yeah. So there's no one single way of doing things. In other words, we recognize diversity. Diversity being an important element in education today, as there's a lot of variety as far as delivering this knowledge is concerned. Therefore, there is no one definition of education. There's no one definition of learning. As long as it conveys an information that is beneficial to that particular person, then I would, in general, call that education or learning to a certain extent. Yeah. So if we don't want to see things as being stereotyped the way we do it, that everybody needs to know the same thing all over. Different people have different talent, and therefore they need to develop different sort of information that is useful to them, different sort of information that is of interest to them, of their passion. And therefore this variety of learning, the variety of educational delivery and standards is something which is important as we move forward, because things will change as we see in this pandemic era the way it is. Yeah? And for that, I think we need to recognize that we have got different routes as far as education is concerned. In other words, the understanding of education from the indigenous point of view, the understanding of education from a colonial point of view are two different things. And they have two different mission also. Colonialization normally would want to standardize the understanding of education into their own context, whereas we have got our own context when we talk about indigenous population. So the whole idea of culture, the whole idea of values, the whole idea of norms, yeah? The rooting of education itself is an important thing in the context of the indigenous population, right? So I want to imagine that we are able to sort of deliver this in the form of education that meets the standards and aspiration of the indigenous population. We cannot gloss over this. we cannot try to make it into mainstream without recognizing that they also have their own idea of what education and standards are all about. Yeah? I call this a global indigenous wisdom because at every culture, in every part of the world, I think we will demonstrate this later, has got their own definition, but yet they are linked together. And this is what we call the common human heritage as far as knowledge is concerned, without denying the differences, without denying the cultural values of each groups as far as education is concerned. So we are now at a crossroad. When we talk about the future, we always talk about the future as though the past is not relevant. Yeah? So in this case, I would want to put together what is the future and what is the past. How can you put this together? Now, as far as the future is concerned, I think we are going into technology, which is nothing wrong. But technology has a tendency to homogenize, to make everything the same, so that everybody will learn things in the similar way, which to a certain extent is useful, but in the context of diversity, it is not useful. So some people call this a kind of a brainwashing, because you are not allowed to deviate into your own traditional way of doing things, to deviate the way you want to do it, the way your ancestors perhaps has conveyed knowledge in the oral history, maybe in one form of knowledge. So this brainwashing things, I think, is something that I would want to look at it in terms of stereotyping. We are stereotyping education, we are giving it just one way of looking at it without recognizing the diversity that we talked about. And this also has something to do with what you call structuring the mind, the way we think, and so on and so forth, which is, I think, is a large contrast when we talk about education from the indigenous population. During my time when I was in school, we still do not have technology the way we have, and yet we use nature as part and parcel of the learning sort of locale as far as education is concerned. So we do lectures under the tree, we go by the river, we sometimes go to the mountains and explore education at the same time. In other words, we're in contact with nature. Unlike today, most of our students, including ourselves, we are not in contact with nature. We are in a very sterile room, full of technological gadgets, but otherwise there's no nature. Whereas in the past, nature is part and parcel of education. Sometimes we do education in a very spontaneous way because we meet other creatures at the same time or see other things that is not within our classroom or even within our immediate environment. And therefore, that kind of education to me is an important education where we begin to actually see what is important to us in the context of real life. Yeah? But that, I think, is slowly also given to technology. Technology has taken it over. Many of the subjects that we taught previously that needs to go to the field is now no longer necessary because of technology. And that is also because some of the places that we used to know has been destroyed. And this is where we talk about ecological degradation, environmental destruction. There is nothing much to learn anymore because most of this has been taken out due to the kind of quote-unquote progress that we see today. And this is, I think, very, very pertinent in the context of the indigenous population. The destruction of the environment, a living lab, as it were, the real living lab has been destroyed, and therefore we do not see the species that we used to see. We do not see the place where we used to be during that particular time when everything was still in a pristine state and a very sort of a real state, as it were, for the purpose of education. So what have we substituted? Before we understand this, what we have substituted in terms of education, and this has something of great relevance as far as indigenous population is concerned. We have turned it into an institution. We have made it very institutionalized. At the end of the day, it's almost like a factory model. As you can see from the diagram, the factory model, you put the people in and then you take them out as though they has been manufactured in between with one standardized way of doing it, the teaching, the curriculum, the pedagogy, even the expectation are standardized. It's a one-size-fits-all. That the diversity that we talked about earlier is no longer important, or in fact, we're now trying to homogenize the diversity into a mono way of looking at it, and therefore we have quote-unquote destroyed education and learning from the way we understand it right before education is modernized in this particular sense. Yeah? So this factory model is the one that takes away the many things that we talked about. That students can learn in a variety of ways, can learn in a way that it is not only about sitting around a table, but an interplay, a mix of many activities by experiencing it with nature, by experiencing with other group of people, and also by working with different age groups and working in the community. All this is part and parcel of education that I at least went through during my sort of study period as a young student then. Yeah? It is not just the classroom, it is a mixture of many other experiences, and that experience I think is important because it gives you a diversity of understanding of what life is all about and how to interact with life and how to learn and make mistakes at that particular point so that your life will be enriched. And that I think now is no longer an important consideration when everything is confined into a classroom with one teacher, with the same group of students over years out, and therefore your experience do not expand the way it used to be expanded during those times. Yeah? And in that sense, I think the traditional education is more autonomous. In other words, there's a lot more flexibility, there's a lot more choice, and there's a lot more interaction that we can have as compared to this westernized, institutionalized way of doing things. And I think this is where the dilemma is. As you move into the future, what do you do with the past? Do you disregard the past and looking at it as something which is irrelevant and just move into the future, which generally becomes even more sterile as compared to what it was before? So the challenge is therefore, I think, is to try and understand where we have gone wrong and how do you actually make an amendment to this. Yeah? I want just to show you again that this factory model that we talked about is really a factory model. Here is a picture of how do you make bread out of flour, and given all the other ingredients that turn the flour into a special bread maybe, and then we put it on a conveyor belt, and then we baked it, and finally I think it is shipped out to a market as a product. Yeah? That is the general idea of what a factory is all about. But if we just change the labeling or the nomenclature for this, the flour could be a student. We don't even call them student nowadays, we call them customer, right? And all these other values that we talk about are the various courses that we talk about. We put it into a receptacle called the curriculum, and then we begin to dispense it over the classroom. Instead of the conveyor belt, I think the student move from classroom to get the knowledge that they want, to the libraries and to the labs and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, there'll be an examination, and once they graduated, then they will be shipped out, just like the bread that we manufacture, and we call that marketability. And then I think this is a preoccupation of the education today. When we go to school or when we go to university, the baseline or the bottom line is about how marketable your student is. It's no longer about education to make them a better person, but how marketable they are. Whether they're a better person or otherwise, it's not something that is considered important today. As long as they got a job, yeah. Sometimes the worst of them gets a job, and then the job becomes something which is very destructive to them because they do not know how to behave as a good human being as such. So this notion of moving to a very standardized, very mechanical, and very, to me, sterile way of education is something that we need to look into as we talk about the indigenous population. And in fact now, given the whole idea of the pandemic, we need to revise this because the pandemic tells us this kind of a model is not sufficient to support life, as it were, when they are having lockdown or when they have got stress problem, which is not part and parcel of the modern curriculum, as it were. I just want to show that this whole idea of mechanizing education is not something which is new. This is a picture of 1910, I think, that talks about you begin to quote unquote the word brainwash. Yeah? You put the knowledge as though in a factory, and then it is then deposited in your head as a kind of indoctrination rather than making knowledge the way we experience it, as I've mentioned, in the traditional understanding of what education is all about. I tend to make this metaphor. Education today is about learning how to ride a bicycle, right? So it is almost like a practice. And anybody or anything can ride a bicycle. These are cases of a monkey. A monkey can ride a bicycle. You've seen sometimes dogs can ride a bicycle. And therefore, human being can ride a bicycle. And we tend to see this as education. In other words, it's a part of training, it's a part of upskilling. It's nothing to do with education the way we understand it, that we can understand and interpret and think about it as a new product from our own minds rather than just exercising it and practicing the way it is. Yeah? So I've got this notion of monkey see and monkey do. So we see what our teachers do, we see what our parents do, we see what our friends do, and we tend to repeat it. And this is what we say, monkey see, monkey do. Yeah? If monkey sees you smoking, then the monkey will be able to smoke at the same time because it's just an imitation. There's no thinking process at all. Yeah? If the monkey see you do something, then they will imitate. And this is what education is all about today for me, that you begin to just follow rather than reinvent and making it innovation. And this is where I think the indigenous population becomes a threat. That we begin to substitute some of the things that they do that is useful to them because they are not in the mainstream, as it were. So when we look at this, then we begin to start thinking, what happens to education as such? Yeah? Education that talks about the thinking process, reinventing in your mind and trying to translate it into real life. I think to me that's education. And therefore all this information that you got, the diversity, and the kind of complicated information that you get, how do you sort out in your mind so at the end of the day it makes sense? Yeah? And that is, I think, the part of education which I think it is largely missing. Although we think it is happening, but it is not happening to the extent what happened before when we take nature into consideration as part of that human space that we talked about. We talked about experience, we talk about the human space. How does these two come together in making education and giving it the meaning that it used to be in terms of bringing the human being in a kind of environment that they can tolerate and survive? Yeah? So, like the human being, the monkey, quote unquote, is also capable of thinking, but the level of thinking may not be the same. The human space that we talked about, the kind of experience that we have as a human person as compared to what other sort of species or other animals do may not be the same. And therefore, this cannot be a repeated sort of experience. So when we say monkey see and monkey do, but what we think that the monkey is not capable of doing is to think the way we think as a human person. The complication, the kind of complexity that is brought up within the thinking process alone, I think is something that differentiates us with that particular animal. Yeah. So when I talk about the human space, this is, I think, where the challenge is all about. If you look at the human space around us, be it from the economic point of view, the ecological point of view, or the whole biospheres, and even in the cultural context, the human space has sort of destroyed itself. So we do not find the human space for learning in many of these structures, as I've mentioned earlier, when you find that the destruction of the environment and the ecology has taken away many of the things that is important as far as education in the natural environment is concerned. So how do you actually deal with this, I think, is what we are going to talk about when we talk about sustainability and the responsible research and innovation as such. Yeah? What it tells me as far as this is concerned is there is a kind of a disconnect. We have got a lot of knowledge that we learn from books or from wherever. Given the technology now, you can go to Google and get whatever information. That is not a problem. But the problem is how do you put that into practice? So what we learn today and what do we practice, I think there is a kind of a disconnect. In fact, the disconnect is very, very clear when we talk about the social media. The social media has demonstrated that all this knowledge that we have got through the media, it is not used for good purposes. The social media, from my point of view, is generally about something which is more negative rather than positive. And therefore, harnessing this information, you've got so much information, but harnessing it for the benefit of other people, even from the benefit of yourself, is something that I think I'm looking at it from a very skeptical point of view. So in other words, we have knowledge, but we do not know how to use this knowledge, how to put it into practice, how to make it happen so that our life is a better life as compared to what it was before. And these are the disconnect that I think we need to put back. And this is where we learn from the indigenous population. What they know and what they practice in the indigenous environment is quite different from what we do today as far as the modern education is concerned. And how do you bring this back? The evidence for this is very clear. If you look at this particular chart here from the year 1750, and this is where the days of the first industrial revolution takes place, when we look at it, there is this exponential growth. In other words, things are moving from a very level sort of way of looking at it into a very high way of production, which we think it is good, but at the end of the day, it becomes counterpoint for us, because when we have too many things of the same thing, then it tends to be sort of a backlash to us. And again, when you look at this in the context of nature, anything that goes up must come down. And we cannot be producing and manufacturing and consuming many things all the time when actually we have enough of this. It's just like knowledge. We have enough of this knowledge, but we have not put it into good practice. So this exponential growth is the one that causes knowledge to be sort of, quote unquote, be destructive for us. And they are not able to put it into practice the way I've mentioned it. And beginning from the year 1950 onward is what we call the Great Accelerator. The Great Accelerator means everything now is produced in large quantities for consumption of human being, although we have enough in terms of the entity that we talked about. Some of the brands that we see today, there are many thousands of brands of the same thing. And therefore, we are creating excess or sometimes surplus, but some of these are not put to use. At the end of the day, they become wasted, and that is part and parcel of the destruction of an environment that we talked about today, which I think is a concern for many of the indigenous population this side. Indeed, to this extent, there's a book written by two very distinguished authors, Noemi Oraquez and Eric Conway, that talks about the collapse of the Western civilization. And they said, if this continue to be the way we do it, the world will collapse in the year 2093, not even 100 years in the first sort of millennium, or the third millennium, sorry. Before that, I think the world will collapse because we are not able to sustain it anymore, given the kind of practices that we do, which is not in tandem with what nature has made us to be. So these are the very important arguments that I want to present to you, why we need to look back. As we go into the future, you must look back and understand what the past is all about and how do you bridge these two gaps together so that the future becomes more meaningful to us. The last evidence is certainly this, when we talk about the world, in the last 12,000 years or 10,000 years, that the world is a place that is conducive for us to live together and to build civilization the way we see it today. And that's because the amount of heat that comes in and out of Mother Earth is something that is well balanced, that we can adapt, that we can make a living out of this. But now this has gone haywire, that we human beings has managed to sort of destroy the earth into what we call the anthropogenic sort of factors that makes a lot more gases, that then the temperature of Mother Earth becomes heated up, and this is what we call the global warming, and later on translated into a climate crisis. And this climate crisis is the one that is going to destroy the civilization that we have got. And that is the point where we need now to begin to shift education, to make sure that we can survive, we can sustain within this world, so that we become the same human species that promote civilization into the future. All right? So issue of global warming, for example, is not even taught in our classroom. I think very few schools in the world that talks about the future in the context of global warming and climate change, because that will be the very important factor to understand whether we could survive the future or otherwise. Yeah? Just to give you a kind of a context, a big picture where we were billions of years ago, yeah, we have been going through many sort of experiences, and the final experiences will be this, what we call the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is an age where we begin to deconstruct our own civilization. You can see around us, yeah? Many of the things that survived before has been taken down because the way we live, because the way we actually understand what life is all about. Creating wealth, which is not a sin, but if it's imbalanced with the kind of values that we've got, then it becomes destructive for all of us. I want to show you this video just to give you a sense of how urgent this is. And this video is made by UNDP to give you that sense of balance, right? Maybe this. As a keynote speaker for this conference.
You okay? You need a minute? Cool. Listen up, people. I know a thing or two about extinction. And let me tell you, and you'd kind of think this would be obvious, going extinct is a bad thing. And driving yourselves extinct, in 70 million years, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. At least we had an asteroid. What's your excuse? You're headed for a climate disaster, and yet every year governments spend hundreds of billions of public funds on fossil fuel subsidies. Imagine if we had spent hundreds of billions per year subsidizing giant meteors. That's what you're doing right now. Think of all the other things you could do with that money. Around the world, people are living in poverty. Don't you think helping them would make more sense than, I don't know, paying for the demise of your entire species? Let me be real for a second. You've got a huge opportunity right now. As you rebuild your economies and bounce back from this pandemic, this is humanity's big chance. So here's my wild idea. Don't choose extinction. Save your species before it's too late. It's time for you humans to stop making excuses and start making changes. Thank you.
Okay, this is from UNDP. It's not a TikTok thing. It's something which is real. The message is quite clear. All right. Until and unless we make changes, real changes, then all of us will go into quote unquote extinction, just like the dinosaurs. And therefore, it is a very important decision that we need to make. Where do we go from here in the context of education? Yeah. What I mentioned earlier was exactly, we have got this knowledge, yeah, to do many things, but yet poverty is rampant. Yeah, starvation is rampant. People are still dying because of very basic necessities that is produced in the millions, but it is not accessible to them. And this is what I meant by there is knowledge, but there's poor translation. And the indigenous population is part of that issue. They're kept in the location they are, maybe in the forest. They are not accessible to these many things that they should also be entitled to, because they are equivalently as a human person like all of us. Yeah? So the disconnect between knowledge and practice is something that I think we need to come back to and understand what it is all about. I think this again is a very important point to make, because many of these issues that we talked about is because of the human person. And this is a graph that I'm going to show you when we do research on global warming, climate change. And many of this research say that we are the one that is responsible, you and me, and maybe the generations to come and the generations before us, maybe not so much them, the generations to come will be part and parcel of this issue, that we become the guilty person. We become the guilty party that creates the so-called imbalance between what we have and what we want. All right? And that imbalance between the macro and the micro world, which I'll go into a little bit more, do not exist anymore. So everything is in a balance, the tipping point that I talked to you about, the lack of human space, the lack of expression, the lack of kind of education that brings us into this idea of the Anthropocene, where we begin to destroy our own civilization. And the word Sejahtera, which we are trying to promote now because it's part of the, what they call national education philosophy, is no longer in existence. So in other words, education has not met its purpose to save human beings, to make human beings better, to enhance civilization. Instead, education has taken us backwards to where we should not be. And I think that's the issue that we need to think about when we talk about the indigenous population. Why does this happen? To my point of view is because we are all now become, quote unquote, very selfish, looking into ourselves alone. A very egocentric way of viewing things. It all starts with what I want and what I have, and then we extend that to the world. Yeah, and therefore the structure that we talk about now is what we call this hierarchical or the pyramidal structure that talks about our rights alone. They do not recognize the rights of others. It's a very rigid structure. If we talk about the blue ocean, there is a red ocean. It is almost a dead structure that do not conform or do not move as quickly as the changes around us. And this structure has allowed us to destroy many of the things because it wants to retain its existence as such. So we need to move into a new structure, what I would call an eco-friendly structure that is quite different from the structure that we have. In terms of education, this pyramidal structure now needs to go away and move into a very flat structure that everybody is in touch with one another. And this is a very networked structure, a flexible structure. It's not about just one person, it's about a whole community, a whole world as it were. Yeah? And it is a blue ocean in the sense that we are allowed to experiment, we are allowed to innovate, we are allowed to be creative, so that it becomes a living structure, just like most of us. We are alive because we can innovate, because we can create, and because we can also be flexible at the same time. If you are not able to do that, I think we are dead long time ago, because the things around us is moving and we are still at the place where we were or we should have been in terms of the changes that is to come. Yeah? So the shift is what education is all about, as far as I'm concerned, and the indigenous population is very, very much part of it. Yeah? As I mentioned, it is a flexible thing, and this is what, to recap what the dinosaur was telling us, it is the opportunity that we have to make it work for us, either it's now or never. Maybe it's late, but it's better late than never. And this is where the perspective of the future becomes important. What is it that we want to do, and how do we do it, given the knowledge or the many knowledge that we've got, and how do we then put into practice, and how do we actually make it beneficial to all of us. One way of looking at this, from my point of view, is to remove or to get away from the old structure that is no longer beneficial, that is no longer relevant to us, and change into a concept, what we call sustainability, which is a way of life. A way of life not only for today, but has been there for a long time. If you talk about the past, then sustainability is part of the past that we are now trying to transport it into the future, but in a perhaps a different way of looking at it. Yeah. So for those who are in Malaysia, we have also already got now this kind of a statement that talks about there will be nature centers that talks about the sustainable development goal, SDG, as part and parcel of moving forward into the new development in the 12th Malaysia Plan, yeah, from here until the year 2025. In other words, we are taking this, we're embracing this as part and parcel of education, not only for classroom, but for the whole nation, for the whole society as such. And that diagram is what I see, is what I present to you with the word sejahtera as a basis for making this balance that we talked about very much earlier. So sustainability is about balance, bringing back the balance that we have lost, and we need to do this through education. And this, as I've mentioned earlier, not something which is new. Around the world, this concept of balance is in almost every culture. For example, you have got in Japan, we call it ikigai. In Sweden, we call it lagom. In Korea, we call it nunchi. In Philippines, we call it ugnayan. Yeah? Ubuntu in Africa, yin and yang in many Chinese sort of environment. The Maori call it Maori also. In our part of the world, in the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara, we call it by the word sejahtera. So this is the basis of knowledge that the indigenous population are very used to. You talk about the indigenous population, the idea of balance is an important concept for them because their world must be balanced as much as our world need to be balanced, but in our case, we have lost the balance. A simple example in this particular context, when you talk about the coronavirus. Yeah? The coronavirus, in a very basic form, is we have lost the balance between the microbes and us. And they have somehow intermingled with one another. At the end of the day, they become sort of a pest to us because that balance or that separation has gone. And that is why I think the very basic idea of wearing a mask, nothing sophisticated, but the idea is to restore the balance again. Yeah? The physical distancing is to restore the balance again. The sanitizing or using sanitizer to clean yourself is again to restore the balance. And the very fundamental of this is to go back into that balance. Once you arrive at balance, then I think this problem will solve by itself. You don't need a vaccination, to be honest with you. If you're so disciplined on this, I think we can sort of, separate ourselves from the cause of the problem, and therefore we can remain the way we used to by maintaining that balance. Yeah? But we have lost this concept of balance, and therefore we go into a different way of looking at it. At the end of the day, we will not be able to sort of manage it if the balance is still not maintained. Yeah? So some of the ideas of this balance goes into different ways of looking at it. For example, let me just give you this ikigai, the word Japanese ikigai. It talks about the reason for being, encompassing joy, yeah, a sense of purpose and meaning, and a feeling of well-being, which is accredited as a factor of longevity and also happiness. And that's what human life is all about. It's about enjoyment, it's about life with a sense of purpose, it's about happiness, it's about making life meaningful for us. And that is the balance that we talked about. Yeah? If we take another extreme, which is the Korean word of nunchi, it's a subtle art of listening and gauging others' mood, the ability to know what not to say in certain social situations. Again, it's about maintaining balance. You say something that do not disrupt the harmony of that community or that environment or that occasion. And you know where to say what at a certain point. And this is, again, this whole question of balance, very subtle, whereas the Japanese have a different concept of this. It's the same concept, but in a very subtle way. And a more direct way is the Swedish word lagom that talks about moderation, a balance, a perfect, simple, suitable a matter of amount, not too much, not too little, just right. Yeah? So this whole concept of balance is a universal concept that we have lost because of the exponential growth that I talked to you about. As you go into this exponential growth, the sort of the balance that we are trying to strive becomes more difficult in this particular context. Whole idea of Ubuntu in Africa also talks about the balance. There's many things that we can capture on this, but given the time, I will just gloss through it, and you have to take it from me that Ubuntu is, again, about creating this balance not only in small communities, but the whole continent as such. Bhutan is a good example where this balance is placed, where happiness becomes the key point of education. It's not about creating wealth, it's about creating happiness within an individual. That every individual in Bhutan knows the limits of their own being and how they can live together in this context of happiness that we talked about. There are many examples, and because of that, you find that Bhutan is the only country that is carbon negative in the world. Remember that I showed you this picture of anthropogenic sort of issues that create global warming. Bhutan is not part of that. Bhutan is able to control it and condone it because of the kind of education that give respect to what the indigenous understanding of what life is all about, where happiness becomes a key factor. Bali and the Subak system, this whole idea of irrigation was there for a long time. Yeah, at least they've got 1,000 years when they talk about sustainability in this particular context. And therefore, this sustainable development idea that we are talking today is part of the past that we now need to bring back as part of education. And this is where, again, the understanding of the indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom that is still working on sustainability is an important source for us as we move into the future. These are the many facts about that, and they use the words Desa Sejahtera. When they talk about the Subak system here, it's a kind of a discussion between the government and the NGO. They talk about Desa Sejahtera, economy merata. In other words, by creating this balance, we can have a shared economy, shared prosperity using that word balance. It is not a domination of one over the other. Again, something which is important as far as education. The Thais has got the same idea of what we call sufficiency economy. So within our NBIT alone in Asia, we already got this whole concept of sustainability, of balance, that I think it is very important for us to embrace, because it is part of the quote-unquote indigenous knowledge that belongs to us long time ago before we arrive at this particular point. This is the former president of India that talks about, in a democracy, the well-being, individuality, and the happiness of every citizen is important for the overall prosperity, peace, and happiness of the nation. Yet, this is not something which is happening around the world today. Many people are not happy. Many people are not in a state of well-being, again, because education has not served the purpose for this. Yeah? So I would like to just very quickly go back to what education is all about and how education now can bring back this whole idea of balance and sustainability that we talked about. I'm going to use our own philosophy of education, Falsafah Pendidikan Kebangsaan, that talks about this balance of the four things: the intellectual, the emotional, the physical, and the spiritual. In the context of education, needs to be balanced. Yeah? It is well spelled out in our education system that at the end of the day, we want to create this balanced human person, that with four elements are well sort of taught and well caught in making life as balanced as possible through the education system. Only with this movement that we can balance now between the two entities of the brain and the heart. This is where I think the indigenous population becomes important. We are not talking only about the brain as a seat of intellect, we're also talking about the heart as a seat of intellect. And how does this two get in a state of a balance, which at the end of the day not only create the individual harmony, but also it's able to create what I call the overall economy, overall harmony between the society, between the environment, and between the economy. Yeah? And the words that I put down here, life, intellect, lineage, wealth, and faith, are the definitions at the end of the day when we talk about sejahtera, that Malay word, or that what you call local word that means happiness. It has to be, again, a kind of a balance between these elements of life, faith, wealth, lineage, and also the intellectual property. So all this idea of a balance in the context of education is something that is important for the future. How do you bring back into the mainstream as far as this concept is concerned? And that's where the indigenous population, I think, becomes an important example that they are still able to sustain it, although they are also diminishing. We need to save it, we need to bring it into the mainstream so that we can then adopt it as, quote unquote, the lifestyle that we need for the future to move on, right? So if we are able to do that, we're able to expand this, then at the end of the day, we should be able to bring back education and to make sure that education is about the well-being of human person, the happiness of the human person, and the well-being of the whole world and humanity as such. Let me finish off with a couple of quotes. Yeah, if you go into indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom, you will see many of these things. Yeah, here, for example, the First Nations in North America largely believe we belong to the earth. The earth does not belong to us. Whereas now in education, as though that we belong, the earth belongs to us and we can do anything with it. We can exploit it, we can destroy it, yeah? But whereas at the end of the day, we will suffer. When we take the indigenous knowledge, or these people in the First Nation, that it's the other way around, that we belong to the earth, not the earth belong to. And therefore, we need to look after the earth. It's a kind of a stewardship. It's a kind of amana. It's a kind of, trusteeship. Yeah? That I need to give this back to the future generation the way I found it, without destructing it, without making it worse, the way it is now. Yeah? Our first teacher is our own heart. Again, this comes from the First Nation. Where is our heart in our education? Heart is not there. And that's why I brought these elements of the heart to show that this is something which is important. All right. This is I think, a kind of a Maori quotation. Well done, you whose courage is like the heart of the tawa tree. They compare that our existence is to a tree that has got a heart. And that's again the kind of comparison that we do not see or do not hear. We always compare it to some machines or something like that, rather than the nature that where we actually belong. Yeah, a Korean proverb: if you know the way, ask one more time. In other words, although we are confident about it, but we want to ensure that the way we move forward is the actual way that actually benefits all of us in this particular context. Yeah. And again, another one: to bend a bamboo while it is still a shoot. This is almost a Malay proverb. Yeah. Melentur buluh dari segi rebungnya. Yeah. Before it becomes hardened into a bamboo, we begin to sort of nurture it to make it also palatable to us. So these are the indigenous knowledge that is we are totally missing. Banyak lagi, if you want to talk about the Malay proverb, ikut resmi padi lagi berisi lagi tunduk, the concept of humility, so that we do not overstep our boundaries. Yeah? Ular menyusur akar tidak akan hilang bisanya, although you have a lot of knowledge, but you are humble enough to share your knowledge, to make sure that everybody benefit from you, not just to possess it to yourself and destroy others. So these are part and parcel of the indigenous knowledge that I think that needs to be taken, that needs to be used, and this is what I think the responsible research and innovation is all about. How responsible are we from the knowledge that we've got, and how much can we actually make it something real that can benefit everybody, not only ourselves. So I guess this is the direction that we need to go. This is where I think at the end of the day, where we want to end with these 5 elements, that we protect life at the same time, we enrich our thinking process through our intellect, and at the same time we save the future generation, our children, our great-grandchildren, yeah, with the wealth that they need to survive, not excessively, and believing in this whole concept of balance and, saving humanity at the same time as a species that needs to survive in the future. So on that note, I will stop. If there is any question after this, we can try and answer them. But otherwise, I would like to thank you for your kind attention, and I hope that's given you some sort of an insight of what we need to do as we move into the future, looking at the past and understanding and respecting the indigenous population, knowledge and wisdom at the same time. Yeah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak, for the inspiring keynote speech. Now, we would like to open the question and answer session. We have about 15 minutes and questions are welcomed from anyone. Please feel free to inquire our honorable speaker, be it in Bahasa Melayu or in English, all are welcome. To do so, please introduce yourself and proceed with the question. Thank you. Anyone? I would like to remind that it's a very rare opportunity for us actually to be with Tan Sri Datuk. So I welcome any one of you to ask questions. Don't worry, you can ask even in Bahasa Melayu.
Maybe if I just can start the ball rolling, Tuan Haji, I think I've been to IPG and I thought your center is one of those that is actually well trained into this whole idea of bringing indigenous population back into the mainstream of education. Yeah? Our experience here, for example, when we talk about indigenous education, we find there's a lot more that we can learn from them. The thing that we have lost, the kind of balance that I talked to you about, we find that there's a lot more in the indigenous population to bring it back. So UNESCO, I think even next week, we'll have another special meeting just to look at indigenous knowledge. How can we learn from indigenous knowledge, particularly in the Western world where they've lost a lot of it. We still have got some in our midst, and I think we need to now use this opportunity to go back and understand our own. Actually, understanding indigenous knowledge is understanding and to understand our own needs that we have lost. After being colonized by the British, everybody has lost many things because we have not focused it into education. So I think your IPG, I think, plays a very important role, and that's why this university wants to support this so that the new education will be a balanced education. Bukan saja modern education, tetapi indigenous education come at the same time.
Dan tanpa membuang masa, saya dengan ini mempersilakan peserta pertama dengan kod CAP 001L, Dr. Wan Kamur Zaman bin Wan Yusof daripada IPG, Kampus Tengku Ampang Afzan, dengan tajuk pembentangan beliau, penerapan elemen nilai murni dan etika dalam pembelajaran abad ke-21 dalam kalangan guru pendidikan khas Kuala Rendah. Dengan segala hormatnya, saya mempersilakan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Louder, please.
First, I'm very. I agree with Professor. It is true that we have to change a lot of things. But I just want to ask us, in reality, because I'm teaching in Polytech, community coordination, talking about sustainability and all.
Penerapan elemen nilai murni dan etika dalam pelajaran abad ke-21 dalam kalangan guru pendidikan khas sekolah rendah. Begitulah bunyi tajuk kajian yang telah saya bersama dengan Dr. Pejali Muhammad daripada kampus Tengku Ampang Ahzan Kuala Lipis telah jalankan ke sempena
in your opinion, I mean, is it how
kali ini.
drastic do you think,
Baik,
or what
sebagai
are the
latar
drastic
belakang
action
kajian,
that we need to take in order for
kita
them to
sedar
really
bahawa Kementerian Pendidikan Malaysia
involved in this
amat memberi penekanan yang serius
so-called movement
terhadap
towards sustainability education, because from what
penerapan
I see
nilai
it's not really
murni dan juga dalam sistem
drastic, it's
pendidikan
not really
Malaysia. Hal ini
strong enough
terbukti dengan
for us to
adanya
make a change.
dokumen PPPM
That's my
2013 hingga 2015
I
yang
think it
menerangkan
really depends
bahawa
on
elemen
how aware
penerapan
we
nilai
are
sebagai
in
elemen yang
terms
perlu
of making
diterapkan
change. I mean,
pada setiap
education
murid.
is about change. To me,
So,
there's no
penerapan
doubt
nilai
about
ini
it. If you go into
kita
education and
tengok
there's
amat
nothing change,
bersesuaian
then
dan
education has
bertepatan
failed.
dengan matlamat
Budak
program
yang masuk
pendidikan
tak
khas
pandai
itu
mengira,
sendiri
and they go
yang
back, dia keluar dia tak
yang
pandai mengira juga,
mensasarkan kepada
education has
satu
failed.
usaha yang berterusan untuk
Budak
melahirkan
masuk
insan,
sekolah dia
murid-murid
baik
yang
tapi dia keluar
berkemahiran,
jadi jahat.
berhaluan,
Education has
berupaya
failed.
dan juga beriman,
So I think we must be very,
serta
very
dapat
clear what
mengurus
we do in
kehidupan
education is to
serta
create
menyedari
this
potensi
human
diri
person
yang
yang
ada pada
actually can
setiap
bring
murid.
important
So
changes. And
nilai,
this is why I go
unsur-unsur
back to
nilai pun
falsafah
ada dalam
pendidikan
matlamat
kebangsaan.
pendidikan
Most
Malaysia.
of you
Dan akhir sekali kita
might be
dapati
bored
bahawa
to
kajian
hear
daripada
this.
medicine
Padahal falsafah pendidikan
2006
kebangsaan dia
menyatakan
very
proses
clear. Dia kata dia setiap
penerapan
pelajar
amat
mesti
penting.
mendapat
Penerapan nilai ini
kesejahteraan
amat
diri.
penting
I think
dilaksanakan
that's
oleh
the word that
guru
most of us miss.
dalam pengajaran mereka secara
Dan
berterusan
kesejahteraan diri
kerana
ini datangnya
ianya
pada
dipercayai
keseimbangan intelek,
mampu
rohani, jasmani dan
dapat
emosi
membentuk
Now, if you look at our education system,
akhlak
kalau
murid
itulah
itu sendiri.
definisinya,
Baik,
di mana
sebagai penyataan
letaknya
masalah,
emosi
kita
dan
dapat melihat bahawa
rohani
tiga perkara
dalam
utama. Yang
pendidikan
pertama sekali,
kita.
kepentingan
Sekurang-kurangnya dia
penerapan
pre-COVID.
penerapan elemen
dalam
nilai
post-COVID
murni dan
baru kita tahu.
PAK dalam
Dia pelajar universiti
kajian
di
kau
UISD
dan juga
nak
Nazamri
bunuh diri.
Hasni 2010 menyebut
Maknanya
bahawa
kita tidak ada skill, kita
kepentingan
tidak ada
penerapan
kemahiran
nilai
itu
ini
untuk
bagi
menjaga
membentuk
atau
sosial murid yang
memupuk atau
seimbang dari
mempertahankan
aspek
emosi
akademik
kita.
dan juga
We don't have
akhlak.
the resiliency,
Dan yang
we don't have the
kedua,
coping mechanism
dia
because we are not
menyatakan
taught.
impak
We are not taught
sekiranya
on
kita
this.
gagal
When falsafah pendidikan kebangsaan mengatakan this is
menerapkan
part
nilai
and
murni
parcel of being
dalam
human.
konteks
Emotionally,
pendidikan
you
pada
must
hari
know how to
ini,
manage yourself.
dia seolah-olah
Spiritually, you must
mampu
know how to manage
untuk
yourself.
menghancurkan
Intellectually
sebuah
and
tamadun
also
dan negara.
physically. But we
Ini
concentrate on
dengan
the
jelas dalam kajian
physical
Hasan
dengan the
So
intellect.
justru
Because there are
kita
exams.
melihat
So this is where my problem starts. Kita melakukan sesuatu kerana kita hendak menguji
supaya
dan ujian
ianya
itu
benar-benar
adalah cara yang
dalam
macam
konteks
saya katakan
Malaysia yang
kalau
kita
kita
cintai.
keluarkan benda ini kita boleh
Guru-guru
uji.
perlu menggunakan
Tapi
satu
manusia
pendekatan
bukan
penerapan
botol, bukan
nilai
kotak,
secara
bukan
langsung
air yang
untuk
boleh kita
menerapkan
uji.
nilai murni dalam
Pengujian
kajian mereka.
itu
Ini
adalah
kajian
satu
oleh
lagi
Somers,
cara
disebut
bagaimana
oleh
kita nak
Colbert,
mengukur
Armstrong
sama ada
dan
orang itu
rakan-rakan.
sejahtera
Guru
ataupun
perlu
tidak dirinya.
memikirkan satu
Ini
alternatif yang
soal-soal
baik
yang ada
untuk
kena-mena
membentuk
dengan
menerapkan
IPG,
nilai
the
dalam
curriculum,
pengajaran
the
mereka.
pedagogy,
Yang
the
kedua,
assessment, all these things needs to be
medicine dan
taught
stigmit
through.
melihat
If
kepada
we don't
proses
know, I
penerapan
know
nilai
for
itu
sure kalau
juga
dalam
amat penting.
6 aspirasi
Amat
kita
penting
katakan etika
dilakukan
dengan
secara
kerohanian
berterusan
tu, saya
dalam
sebagai daripada
sepanjang
padu,
masa
dan kita dapat
PDP.
the worst
Soalnya
performance
sekarang
itulah daripada
kita
etika
melihat
dengan
kepada beberapa isu
kerohanian
dan
ni
juga
kerana
cabaran yang
tak tahu
dihadapi.
apa nak ukur.
Yang pertama, Rashidah menyebut
So we are landed
bahawa
into an
kekangan
issue
masa merupakan
that we do not
karangan
know
yang
how to
utama
do it and therefore
dalam
we
kita
don't even
membentuk dan
practice it.
menerapkan elemen
Sedangkan masa
nilai murni dan
saya
juga etika
belajar
dalam
dulu,
PAK 21.
kalau kita
Hal ini juga
dapat
disokong dengan
sesuatu
berapa
itu,
lagi
kita
Abdul Halim
melihatkan
Tamuri
akhlak itu sebagai
umpamanya
ukuran.
menyebut kemudahan
Now,
teknologi
for example,
digital juga
I am your
merupakan
KPI.
cabaran yang
The way I
menjadi
deliver my lecture,
cabaran
the
yang
kind of work
terbesar
that I do,
untuk guru menyuntik
the
dan
slides
juga
that I show, the
membentuk
argument that I
akhlak
presented, that is
murid-murid
your
di sekolah.
evaluation
Yang ketiga,
on me. Tak
Sufiah
payah
menyatakan bahawa sikap murid
CV
itu
ni kadang
sendiri
berjela-jela.
yang
Tapi
menunjukkan
presentation dia
keengganan, menunjukkan
Dia tidak ada perseimbangan.
penolakan
dapat
terhadap
itu,
apabila
dapat ini,
proses
dapat itu,
penerapan
tapi
nilai
tengok dia
itu
punya
berlaku.
presentation.
Okey.
Ya Allah,
So kajian
ini
ini
orangnya.
pada para
So sometimes saya
panel
tak mau baca
penilai dan
CV,
juga
tak
sidang
payah.
pendengar serta
You just look at what I've
kita
done,
mensasarkan
what you
kepada
have done,
tiga
and
objektif
can you
utama.
see that
Yang pertama
your
sekali adalah
presentation
untuk
is
mengenal
actually
pasti
who you are.
kepentingan penerapan nilai itu
Dan kalau
sendiri
presentation
dalam
kita tak up
kalangan
to standard, maknanya kita
murid.
merasa malu.
Kita nak
There is
melihat
this-
kepentingan.
this
Yang
already
kedua, kita
impression
nak
that you
mengenal
feel so
pasti
embarrassed that
penerapan
your
nilai itu
presentation is
sendiri,
not up to mark.
penerapan nilai apakah
Ini dia
kaedah-kaedah
cara-cara
penerapan
kita
nilai, dan
menilai
yang
dulu,
ketiga kita nak mengenal
menilai
pasti
diri kita
cabaran
begitu saja.
yang
Tidak
ada yang
tidak
dihadapi
ada
oleh guru
tidak
dalam
ada
proses
nombor, tidak
penerapan
ada
nilai
angka,
dan etika
tidak
dalam
ada
PAK
dan
sebagai 21 dalam
tapi kita
kalangan
sendiri
guru pendidikan
merasakan
khas.
bahawa
tiga
akhlak kita,
matlamat
maruah
objektif
kita,
ini
kita yang
dipandu
menjaganya.
oleh
Ya. Sebab
tiga
itu dulu
persoalan
masa
kajian
saya
yang
sekolah,
kita
sekarang tak pernah
fikir
dengar dah.
sekiranya
Ya.
dapat
Dia
memenuhi,
kata,
dia
jangan
boleh
conteng
mencapai
arang
dan
di
juga
muka mak
menjawab
dan bapa.
persoalan menjawab
Sekarang ini
objektif
kita
kajian
conteng
yang
kiri
telah
kanan
kami
tak peduli
gerakkan
pun.
sekarang. Yang pertama sekali, apakah
That is the
kepentingan,
kind of value
apakah
that
kaedah
you
dan
want to
juga
put
apakah
back into the
cabaran
education
yang
system,
dihadapi
dan
oleh
kita
guru.
menjadi
So tiga soalan ini
penjaga
sudah
diri kita
kami
sendiri. I
yakin
don't have any,
mampu
I don't
menjawab
need teachers to look
objektif
after me,
matlamat kajian
because
ini.
I can look
Baik,
after
so
myself.
di
I
berikut
know
adalah
the kind of
sedikit
value that I need to do.
conceptual
Kalau datang
framework,
mesti tepat dengan masanya. Kalau buat
kerangka
kerja
kajian
mesti
yang kami
elok
fikir boleh
kerjanya.
memberi
Yang
gambaran
terbaik
umum
yang kita
terhadap
boleh
kajian yang
bagi.
kami
This is the
laksanakan.
kind of
Yang pertama
change
sekali
yang kita
kita
nak
melihat
lihat
kepada guru
dalam
pendidikan khas.
pendidikan.
Guru
Ya.
pendidikan khas
Dan
pada
ini
hari
tidak
ini
lagi
dia
berlaku
memang
di
di sekolah sudah
Ini tidak lagi berlaku. I mean, I'm very
sudah
critical,
mengajar,
ya.
tetapi
Mana kita
elemen
ambil
penerapan nilai murni
program
itu nampaknya
sejahteraku,
sukar untuk
sekolahku
dilaksanakan oleh
sejahtera.
kerana beberapa asbab.
Ada
Beberapa
14 benda yang
perkara-perkara
dikatakan
sebab-sebab
sejahtera itu.
yang
Tapi
menyebabkan
kalau
mereka
kita ambil sejahtera yang
terhalang untuk
diajar di
proses
sekolahku
penerapan
sejahtera
nilai.
ini,
Okey.
dengan
So
sejahtera dan
kajian
falsafah
ini
pendidikan
melihat dari
kebangsaan,
sudut
dia
reka
tidak ada
bentuknya adalah
kena-mengena
kajian kualitatif di mana
Kalau kita
kita
katakan
menganalisis mengikut
dalam-
tema.
dalam-
Yang pertama
dalam,
kita melihat kepada
falsafah
kepentingan,
pendidikan,
yang kedua
kerohanian,
kaedah, yang
roh.
ketiga
Dalam
adalah
sekolahku
cabaran.
sejahtera,
Yang
R
kedua
itu bukan roh.
sampling yang
R
kami
itu
gunakan,
rasional, tak salah
sampel yang kami gunakan
Mana
adalah
datangnya
4
rasional
orang
ni?
guru pendidikan khas
Siapa yang kata
di
rasional
salah
mengapa roh
sebuah
tidak ada di
sekolah
situ?
rendah
Ya,
di
kalau kita
sekitar Raut.
bercakap tentang
Dan
falsafah pendidikan
cara kami
kebangsaan.
memilih, kaedah
Kalau
kami
A
pemilihan
di
sampel
ujung
adalah
sejahtera
mengikut
itu
sampel
akhlak.
secara bertujuan.
Tapi A di
Kerana
ujung,
apa? Kerana
sekolahku
kajian
sejahtera artikulasi.
sampel ini merupakan
Mana datang
guru-guru
artikulasi
yang
ni?
terlibat secara
So kita
langsung
mencampur
kepada
adukan
proses
pendidikan kita
pembentukan
sebagai
dan juga
seorang yang
mendidik
faham tentang
murid-murid
pendidikan,
pendidikan
seolah-olah
khas
kita
di
tidak faham.
sekolah. Dan
Lepas tu
guru-guru
kita kata
ini
pelajar kita
sudah
tak bagus.
mempunyai lebih
Sedangkan
pengalaman,
kita langsung tidak
lebih 5
mewarisi
tahun
dan
ke atas
memahami falsafah
dalam
itu.
bersama-sama
Dan kita
proses
menggunakannya seolah-olah
membentuk
kita percaya yang ini dia falsafah
pendidikan khas di
Itu
sekolah.
peranan guru.
Dan
Itu
kaedah
peranan
pengumpulan
kita sekarang.
data
Kita
kami
sekarang ni
dilakukan
mesti jadi orang
secara
macam Cikgu
temubual
Fazli ni.
dan juga melalui
Bercakap
kajian-kajian
tentang apa yang betul
perpustakaan
dan
yang
perlu kita
lepas.
tegur
Baik,
orang
kita
yang
melihat
tidak
kepada
membetul, tak kira
finding
siapa.
ataupun
Itu
dapatan
peranan kita.
kajian.
So I think
Apakah
the role
kepentingan?
now
Kepentingannya
dalam
yang
konteks
pertama
ini adalah
sekali,
untuk
guru
meletakkan
kata,
balik
responden kata
pendidikan
dia boleh melahirkan
dalam
murid yang ada moral,
arus yang sepatutnya
murid yang
berlaku.
ada nilai tinggi,
Dan kita
yang ada
sebagai
unsur
orang yang
kasih
terdidik
sayang, syukur dan
terlatih,
sebagainya. Yang
patut
kedua,
menegur siapa-siapa saja
responden menyebut
yang tidak
apabila
membuat
murid
sedemikian.
yang tantrum,
So, bila
bila
kita
murid
cakap
yang
tentang
suka
teknologi
dikawal,
misalnya,
murid yang
saya
mengamuk dan
tidak-
sebagainya,
saya bukan
murid ini
orang,
sentiasa
I'm
diingatkan
not
apabila
anti-teknologi.
diingatkan dengan
Tapi kalau
nilai-nilai
kita
murni,
lihat bagaimana
akhirnya
kita
murid yang
mendidik
tantrum
anak-anak
itu
kita
dapat
baca je
terima.
lah buku,
Dengan syarat kita sebagai
Bill Gates
guru,
misalnya. Bill
responden
Gates
menyebut bahawa
mengatakan
ianya
dia
perlu
memberi alat
diingatkan dari semasa ke
kepada
semasa.
anaknya
Yang
bahasa
ketiga,
anaknya umur 14
responden
tahun.
juga menyebut bahawa
Bukan
perlu
lahir-lahir
kepada
je
penerapan
dapat
nilai
ini.
murni
Kita
sebab mereka
anak-anak
dapat
kita lahir je dah
membezakan
bagi satu
antara yang baik dan yang buruk.
peranti.
Kalau dapatan,
Ya.
ketiga-tiga
Kerana apa dia
dapatan
kata dia
ini
nak mendidik,
nampaknya
memupuk
amat
pemikiran
selaras dan
anak dia
bertepatan
itu
dengan dapatan
secara
KAU
semula jadi
2013,
sebelum dia
Nuzamri
menggunakan
Dahasni 2010, Noor Azri
Tapi
Muhammad
kita
Khairi
lain. Kita menggunakan
2017
peranti itu
yang
seolah-olah
menyatakan
peranti
bahawa
itu
kepentingan
mendidik
penerapan
pemikiran
nilai
kita.
murni
Sedangkan fikiran
adalah
kita ni
penting
ada
bagi
fitrahnya.
membentuk sahsiah yang
Jadi kita
seimbang.
balik ke soal roh tadi.
Seimbang
Fitrah
dari
itu yang
sudut
memupuk
akademik
kita
dan juga
dan kita menggunakan fitrah itu dengan bantuan peranti kemudian. Itu
akhlak.
mesti ada asas dulu,
Okey.
mesti ada
Yang
modal
pertama.
dulu
Yang
baru
kedua,
kita nak guna peranti.
dapatan
Sekarang
yang
kita tidak ada
kedua.
modal sebab tu
Apakah
bila kita
kaedah
gunakan
yang
peranti
digunakan?
ini, kita
Baik.
menggunakannya
Yang pertama
seolah-olah
sekali
tidak ada
kita
nilai
melihat
padanya.
pada kaedah.
Media sosial kita
Kaedah
lihat.
yang
Ya. So these
digunakan
are
adalah
issues which is
penerapan
very
nilai secara
important
yang bersesuaian.
for us to understand,
Kaedah
for
yang
IPE
berdasarkan
to understand,
rancangan
for
dan
guru
topik
to
apa yang
understand,
diajar
so
pada
that
waktu
kita
itu.
sebenarnya dapat satu model
Kali ini kita
yang
tengok
boleh
dapatan
kita
ini amat selaras
gunakan
dengan
untuk
Wogeles.
memupuk
1996 menyebut
yang
guru
dikatakan
perlu membuat
sejahtera.
perancangan yang teliti
Ya.
sebelum
Mengapa
PMP
ini
bermula.
penting dalam
Okey,
falsafah
yang
dia
kedua
kata
melalui
hanya orang
aktiviti
sejahtera
berkumpulan
dirinya saja
seperti
boleh menyumbang
amali, qauli, contohnya
kepada
apabila
masyarakat,
aktiviti
keluarga dan negaranya. So kalau kita lihat sekarang ni
Berwudu.
mengapa sekolah kita banyak
juga
masalah-masalah yang tidak sepatutnya
boleh
berlaku.
menerapkan
Kerana pelajar-pelajar kita
kaedah yang
sejahtera
digunakan
dengan
oleh
ingat.
guru melalui
Sekolahnya
aktiviti
mungkin
perkumpulan.
sejahtera,
Yang
tapi
ketiga
pasca pelajaran tidak sejahtera.
juga
Yang
aktiviti
kita nak
perkumpulan
manusia
iaitu
itu sejahtera.
semasa
Sekolahnya akan
guru
sejahtera
mengajar dan
secara
rakan-rakan
automatik
membuat
kalau
persembahan,
manusia
ada
ni sejahtera.
unsur-unsur hormat,
These are
menghormati
issues yang I think
dan
that you need
taat
to discuss.
menaati
These are
dalam
the issues I
kalangan
think that we need
murid
to bring
Merdeka Khas.
forward.
Dalam hal
These are the
ini,
issues yang
kajian Nurul
post-pandemic
Ahmad
akan
2018
menghantui kita
mengatakan
kalau kita tidak
memang
betul-betul.
jelas
Dia dah
bahawa
tunjuk. Kalau
kaedah
sekarang ini kita
perbincangan,
tidak
kaedah
diperbetulkan, the
perkumpulan
next
ini
pandemic kita
dapat
akan
memupuk
menjadi
nilai-nilai
lebih
murni.
pucah kacir
Disokong
dalam hal
dengan
ini kerana
buton
pendidikan kita
kaedah
tidak selaras.
perbincangan ia dapat
I
memberi
hope I've
kesan
answered your
positif
question,
kepada
Razak.
murid.
Tidak cukup dengan itu, kita melihat
Yes,
bahawa
Prof. Thank you very
salah
much.
satu
I
bentuk lagi
totally
adalah
agree
melalui
with you.
penghargaan.
And,
Ada guru yang
if
memberi
I may
coklat
add,
atau
I
gula-gula.
think it's
Ada
very
guru yang
clear that,
membuat
the
penghargaan
attitude of
melalui
students is
sambutan
very
hari lahir,
different
hari
after the
jadi,
post-pandemic.
hari kebesaran dan sebagainya. Kalau kita dapati Lola pernah sebut bahawa 1985 ganjaran dalam bentuk sedar maupun tidak sedar seperti penghargaan ataupun yang perlu diberikan bagi memupuk tingkah laku yang
kita misalnya
positif dalam
kalau saya
kalangan.
tanya pelajar-pelajar
So yang
saya
ketiga,
what has changed, dia
para
kata we have
panel
done everything
penilai,
online,
sidang pendengar
which
dan
is
juga
fine.
penonton.
Tapi
Kita
benda
melihat
yang dibuat
soalan
begitu
kajian
juga.
yang terakhir adalah apakah
Kalau
cabaran
dulu
yang
dia
dihadapi.
membeli
Dalam hal ini kami
secara
menyadari tiga
fizikal
cabaran
benda-benda
utama.
yang
Yang pertama
tak
sekali
perlu
masa.
pun dia belinya
Ada
juga.
responden
Kita
menyebut bahawa
mengharapkan masa
kadang-kadang tak
pandemik itu
sempat
dia mula
nak ajar
mengurangkan
mengajar
tabiat
nilai.
membeli benda-benda
Kadang-kadang
yang
ada
tak
masalah-masalah
apa tu, yang
tertentu.
tak perlu.
Murid bising dan sebagainya,
Tapi
murid
dia
buat hal
menggunakan
dan
juga
sebagainya, murid
caranya
tantrum
dia
dan
berbeza.
sebagainya, maka sekarang tak sempat
Dia
untuk
menggunakan
mengajar nilai.
online, tapi
So
benda
Nazrin
itu
telah
juga
jelaskan
tabiatnya begitu
bahawa
juga.
kekangan masa
Dalam
menyebabkan
pendidikan
guru
pun
tidak
saya
dapat
nampak begitu
memberi
je,
perhatian.
perbincangannya
Ini
only the method change,
disokong dengan Zamri dan
but the
juga Hasmi
premise has not
menyatakan
changed.
kekangan masa telah memberi
The framework
kesan
has not changed.
kepada
The
pengajaran
framework is
dan
an
proses
old
pengajaran.
framework juga,
Begitu
yang
juga dengan cabaran yang
membazir
kedua,
dan
pemahaman
sebagainya
murid.
masih kita
Ada murid yang
gunakan,
tak
tapi
faham katanya
caranya cara
guru.
online.
Hal ini sebut dengan
I
Thomas
think this is a
Colbert
discussion
pernah
that I'm
sebut
very
bahawa
worried about.
guru perlu
Bagi
menggunakan
peranti, bagi
pendekatan
peranti fine, tapi
yang
apa gunanya?
penerapan nilai
Kita
yang
mengharapkan
secara
memberi
bersesuaian.
peranti ni
Yang
dia
ketiga
memula
adalah
menukar tabiatnya sekali.
kaedah
And that
penerapan
change
nilai
of
itu sendiri.
character is
Macam mana nak
basically what
tegur mereka
education is
pasal
all about.
murid, setiap
If
murid
education
berbeza,
does
ada
not
yang guna
change the
cara lembut
character,
dan
then I
juga
think
ada yang
the education has failed. Yeah. Penyangak masuk dalam sekolah kita dan dia keluar menjadi lebih penyangak, then education has failed. That is very clear to me. So are we making that right behavioral change ataupun tidak? If we are not, then I think we really need to think about it. Yeah, and this goes to right across.
Okey, sekian saja pembentangan saya daripada Dr. Wan Kamul Zaman di atas pembentangan sebentar tadi.
Now dalam
Ini
interview
seterusnya saya buka kepada penilai serta para hadirin sekalian untuk mengemukakan
yang lain boleh
soalan.
belajar. Tak tahu peranti boleh belajar, tak tahu ini boleh belajar.
Encik Hakim, boleh saya tahu penilai Dr. Chin ada? Dr. Chin boleh mula dulu?
Tak boleh ajar dah.
Ya, ada
kalau
saya
umur
sini.
dah 18 tahun, 19 tahun nak tukar balik difficult.
Tengah hari
And therefore the question now for interview itu je about values. The values that you hold, not the things that you know. The things that you know we can teach you, but the values that you hold
atas
is something that
kajian
you
yang saya
cannot
rasa
teach you
menarik
once you
sebab
have
penerapan nilai murni
That is
adalah
education
sesuatu
for
yang
the
abstrak
future.
dan
Nilai,
memang
terbalik
mencabar.
pada soal nilai.
Kalau subjek lain saya rasa mungkin kita boleh test by pen and paper kan, tapi
Ada
kalau
lagi
nilai
soalan?
murni ni
Soalan
dia abstrak ada
Saya kalau
memang
boleh nak
mencabar
pergi
sikit lah.
ke
Jadi saya ada
tempat tu,
beberapa
tempat
soalan untuk Dr. Kamarul Zaman. Yang pertamanya kan Dr. cuba terangkan kenapa fokus doktor adalah untuk guru pendidikan khas. Adakah sebab ada kelainan situasi berbanding dengan guru yang bukan pendidikan khas?
Okey, baik Dr. Chin, moderator dan juga Dr. Siva. Okey. Pertama sekali kami fokus dalam perkhidmatan bimbingan dan kaunseling. Okay. Kita tidak mahu melihat kepada satu skop sahaja, skop sekolah rendah, sekolah menengah, universiti, tanpa kita meminggirkan kumpulan yang kita kata orang kelainan upaya ini. Dalam skop kami nak remajakan, kami nak cuba meremajakan lagi perkhidmatan bimbingan kaunseling. So kami fokus kepada kami juga tidak mahu meminggirkan kumpulan yang saya kata istimewa ini. Why not? Kalau kita tengok benda lain, kita agak mementingkan mereka. Jadi pada kali ini kami fikir sebab mereka juga rasa terpinggir dan mereka rasa perkhidmatan psikososial ini sangat dirindui dan ditagih oleh kumpulan mereka. Dan hasilnya kita melihat sebab kajian sebelum ini berdasarkan kajian yang kami baca, ianya sangat kurang kepada kumpulan-kumpulan istimewa seperti yang saya sebutkan dalam pendidikan khas. Jadi justru itu perkhidmatan bimbingan dan kaunseling harus, bagi saya, pandangan saya harus terjun ke bidang pendidikan khas supaya kita boleh melihat secara holistik.
Terima kasih, Prof.
Skop yang kita mahu, iaitu psikologi dan juga pedagogical nilai ini. Itu saja Dr. Chin.
Okey, terima kasih Dr. Kamarul Zaman. Jadi nampaknya sebab fokus pada pendidikan khas sebab ada jurang situ lah kan, ada gap situ betul tak?
Ya, kita tidak mahu pinggirkan mana-mana kumpulan dalam aspek meremajakan perkhidmatan bimbingan dan kaunseling itu sendiri.
Ya, okey, saya faham. Jadi berdasarkan dapatan daripada kajian ini, kalau banding dengan dapatan kajian lain yang mungkin selama ni tak fokus sangat pada pendidikan khas, Jadi adakah Dr. Kamaruzaman menjumpai apa-apa kelainan penemuan pada pendidikan khas berbanding